Our daughter's been taken and nothing's ever going to be as bad as that. It's still been difficult, it's been emotive.
I think the highlight's really just been the team working together. Obviously it's been quite tough. There's been a lot of miles and a lot of climbing, and there's obviously highs and lows and that, and the fact that we've all worked together so well. And I think we all know why we're here. We know it's for such a good cause, and that just keeps you going. Yeah, I know this won't help Madeleine.
If you lost your child the night before, and the next morning, while it was still dark, you and your spouse quietly walked through deserted streets, opening large dumpsters one by one, yet never told the police about it, what exactly would you be hiding? In the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, it's not what was revealed that raises the most suspicion. It's what was deliberately withheld. The e-fits that were never shown. The statements that came too late, and the 2 silent hours between 5 and 7 a.m. on May 4, 2007, when no one knows what they were doing. In her memoir Madeleine, Kate McCann recounts a moment on the morning of May 4, 2007, that is perhaps one of the most quietly devastating reflections in the entire case. She writes, "I remember opening a big dumpster-type bin and saying to myself, please God, don't let her be in here." The line is short, subtle, yet the implications are profound. It reveals a raw, terrifying moment in which a mother contemplated the unimaginable possibility that her daughter might have been discarded like waste. And, just as significantly, it suggests that she and Gerry physically checked inside large bins during their early morning search. This action, coupled with other unexplained behaviors, forms the foundation for one of the more unsettling theories in the Madeleine McCann case: that her body may have been disposed of in a dumpster and removed via the municipal waste system, never to be found again. To understand why this theory is considered plausible, we need to look at the circumstances surrounding that morning. Between 5 and 7 a.m. on May 4, the day after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate and Gerry left the apartment and ventured outside on their own. This early outing was not mentioned in their initial police statements in 2007. Instead, it came to light through the witness statement of their friend Fiona Payne, who confirmed that the McCanns had knocked on her door around 5 a.m., asking her and her husband to watch their twins while they stepped out. Another witness, Paulo George Fernandez Nito, reported seeing the McCanns walking alone near the street at approximately 7 a.m. While the couple would later describe this as a desperate search for their daughter, it remains striking that they omitted this significant detail from their official testimonies at the time. Why? This 2-hour window, still dark, eerily quiet, and devoid of police presence, was in many ways the ideal time to act unnoticed. Praia da Luz, a sleepy resort village, would have been largely still, and within walking distance of the Ocean Club apartments were multiple dumpster-style bins scattered throughout the area. On the 2007 map of the village, many of these dumpsters are marked, particularly near apartment 5A and the Tapas restaurant, where the McCanns dined. The placement of these bins is telling. They were located in areas that were both accessible and discreet. Several were reachable by small paths and back streets that would have allowed a person to avoid main roads entirely. In other words, a person who knew the layout of the village and who had private access to time and movement in those early hours could conceivably use one of these bins without being seen. Given that both Kate and Gerry were avid runners and had explored much of the area during their stay, it is reasonable to believe they were familiar with the locations of these disposal points. However, the most troubling aspect of this theory is not simply the bins themselves, but what happened to their contents. Portuguese police did not search the dumpsters immediately. The first formal inspection took place on May 7th, 4 days after the disappearance. By then, many of the bins had already been emptied by municipal garbage services. Their contents would have been compacted and transported to the regional waste processing system, ultimately destined for the Barlavento landfill located north of Praia da Luz. More specifically, they would have been deposited in a section of the landfill known as Cell C. This subsection of Barlavento was in active use between 2006 and 2010, perfectly aligning with the timeline of the McCann case. According to public records and local sources, Cell C received the bulk of residential and tourist waste from the Luz area. In 2011, following persistent complaints from local residents about the smell, Cell C was sealed with plastic sheeting and then further buried under newer layers of refuse. As a result, the specific section where waste from May 2007 would have been dumped is now several meters below the surface, compacted beneath years of additional garbage and earth. The logistical barriers to searching Cell C are significant. Excavating the area would require heavy machinery, extensive permits, specialized teams, and massive financial resources. More critically, it would carry no guarantee of success. Because of the intense pressure under which landfill waste is stored, any human remains, especially those of a small child, would be subject to extreme physical degradation. In such an environment, bones can be shattered beyond recognition. Soft tissue is quickly consumed by bacteria and decaying organic matter. Without precise information about where in the landfill to search, the likelihood of finding even trace evidence is remote. Kate McCann mentioned that Madeleine had been wearing pink cotton pajamas the night she disappeared. Cotton, being a biodegradable material, would decompose quickly in landfill conditions, particularly under pressure and in the presence of moisture and bacteria. If the body had been wrapped in a plastic garbage bag, something commonly used in domestic waste disposal, it could have delayed decomposition or masked the scent temporarily. However, it would not have prevented the eventual collapse of the remains under weight and time. To better understand the plausibility of this, one can look at a comparable case from Portugal. In 2015, investigators located partial remains believed to be of a newborn at the Seixal landfill. Due to the landfill's dense and hazardous conditions, only limited recovery was possible. Despite forensic efforts, nothing more could be retrieved. This real-world precedent illustrates just how easily human remains, especially those of infants or small children, can be lost forever in a modern landfill. Taking all these details into account, the hypothesis that Madeleine McCann's body may have been placed in a dumpster and carried away by municipal waste collection is grim, but tragically feasible. It would account for the lack of forensic evidence in apartment 5A. It would explain the urgency and secrecy of the McCanns' early morning outing. And it would underscore the significance of Kate's brief yet loaded comment about opening a dumpster in fear of what she might find. Of course, no direct evidence supports this theory conclusively. But in a case defined by absence of witnesses, absence of security footage, absence of physical proof, the presence of such a chilling possibility continues to unsettle both investigators and the public alike. What makes this theory resonate is its silent logic. It answers too many lingering questions with one horrifying scenario. The real tragedy, perhaps, is that if this theory is true, there may never be closure. The Cell C section of the Barlavento landfill is, for all practical purposes, a sealed grave, an enormous, anonymous resting place layered with 1,000 stories of discarded things. If Madeleine McCann's story ended there, it would have ended in the most silent, invisible way imaginable. And it may be that no one, not even her parents, could have predicted that such a theory would remain viable more than a decade later. Yet here we are, still searching, still asking, still hoping that in a case so full of shadows, a single trace might one day see the light. In any criminal investigation, especially one involving a missing child, the hours immediately following the disappearance are crucial. Every movement, every word, every decision made during that time is studied with painstaking detail by investigators. It is during this window that clues are most fresh, memories most reliable, and opportunities for recovery most viable. That is why the unexplained actions, or lack of explanation, by Kate and Gerry McCann between 5 and 7 a.m. on the morning after Madeleine vanished have drawn such intense scrutiny. What makes this particular time frame so unusual is not just what the McCanns may have done, but what they failed to disclose. Nowhere in their official police statements from 2007 do Kate or Gerry mention leaving their apartment during those 2 critical hours. This omission is not a simple oversight. It's a silence that sits awkwardly within the broader context of a case that has become one of the most heavily analyzed disappearances in modern history. Their failure to report this early morning outing to investigators, especially given how close it was to the time of Madeleine's disappearance, has left a conspicuous gap in the timeline. That silence becomes more suspicious when contrasted with the testimony of those around them. Fiona Payne, a close friend and member of the so-called Tapas 7 group who accompanied the McCanns on their holiday, confirmed under official questioning that Kate and Gerry did, in fact, leave the apartment around 5 a.m. Fiona stated that Kate had knocked on her and her husband David's door, explaining that she and Gerry could not sleep and were overwhelmed by the helplessness of doing nothing. According to Fiona, Kate said they wanted to go out and search for Madeleine and asked if the Paynes would watch over the twins while they were gone. This account is crucial. Not only does it provide the only direct confirmation that the McCanns were away from their apartment at that time, but it also shows that the excursion was premeditated, not a spontaneous decision. They didn't simply go out for air. They woke their friends, requested supervision for their remaining children, and left, yet somehow chose not to include any of this in their official statements to police. Why would they exclude such a significant detail? That question becomes even more pertinent when considering the testimony of a local witness, Paulo Jorge Fernandes Neto. Neto told police that around 7 a.m. on the morning of May 4, he saw Kate and Gerry McCann walking alone on the street near his place of work. This independent sighting adds weight to Fiona Payne's account and helps establish a broader time frame for their absence. If they left the apartment at 5 a.m. and were still seen walking alone 2 hours later, where exactly were they during that time? This 2-hour period is now widely regarded as a dark zone in the investigation, an unaccounted for stretch in which no one accompanied the McCanns, no surveillance footage was recorded, and no other witnesses, apart from Neto, reported seeing them. No neighborhood security, no CCTV footage, and no other members of the Tapas group were present to validate or even approximate their movements. In effect, from 5 to 7 a.m., the McCanns were completely off the radar. This level of unobserved activity is rare in high-profile investigations and raises uncomfortable questions. Why didn't they disclose it from the beginning? Why wait? What were they doing during that time? And most importantly, if there were something to hide, wouldn't that be the time to do it? Further complicating matters is the fact that Kate McCann did eventually discuss the outing, but not in any of the many interviews or official follow-ups conducted in the months and years immediately after Madeleine's disappearance. Instead, she included the anecdote in her book Madeleine, published in 2011, 4 years after the fact. In that account, she describes the early morning of May 4 as a desperate search. She and Gerry wandered unfamiliar streets, jumped over walls, searched through undergrowth, and even looked inside large dumpsters. In one particularly striking moment, she recalls opening a bin and praying, "Please God, don't let her be in here." While that passage has garnered attention for its emotional weight, it also raises a procedural concern. Why did such a crucial episode appear in a commercially published book and not in the original police interviews? The omission was not incidental. It was a conscious editorial choice. And while the motive for that silence remains unknown, the delay in sharing this information has deeply impacted how observers view the integrity of the McCanns' statements. By 2011, the media landscape surrounding the case had shifted dramatically. Public sentiment was mixed, and theories about parental involvement, both fair and unfounded, were already circulating widely. To some readers, the inclusion of the early morning search in Kate's book appeared as a long overdue correction. To others, it seemed like a strategic narrative insertion, offering an emotionally potent, humanizing story that had somehow been forgotten for 4 years. Critics point out that if the couple had truly spent that early morning scarring the village in panic, they would have reported it immediately, especially in light of the intense police scrutiny they faced. After all, if your child is missing and you've been out searching for her in the cold dawn, Why omit that from your testimony? Why leave out the very thing that might demonstrate your desperation and innocence? The answer remains elusive. Perhaps it was an oversight. Perhaps it was emotionally too difficult to relive at the time. Or perhaps, as some suspect, there were reasons, strategic or otherwise, not to mention it. Regardless of intent, the implications are clear. The unreported outing introduces a blind spot into the case's early timeline. It's a moment when two key individuals were unaccounted for, with no third-party validation of their whereabouts or actions. And in a case defined by ambiguity, that absence is deafening. Ultimately, the early morning of May 4 remains one of the most unsettling voids in the McCann case. While it may not prove guilt or wrongdoing, it undeniably raises questions about transparency, memory, and the complex human instincts that arise in crisis. Whether it was an innocent omission or something more calculated, the unexplained movements of Kate and Gerry McCann during those quiet 2 hours continue to cast a long shadow over the mystery of what really happened to Madeleine. In the intricate and often confounding investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann, few details have raised more persistent questions than the suppression of the SMITHMAN e-fit. This facial composite, drawn in 2008 from the description of Irish holidaymaker Martin Smith and his family, may have been one of the most vital leads in the case. And yet, remarkably, it remained hidden from public view for nearly 7 years. The reasons for this delay, and the striking resemblance of the e-fit to Gerry McCann himself, continue to fuel suspicion and debate. The e-fit in question was created by Oakley International, a private detective agency hired by the McCann family in 2008 using funds from the Find Madeleine Fund. At the time, the fund was widely supported by public donations intended to help find the missing child. Oakley International's assignment was straightforward: investigate new leads, analyze existing witness statements, and identify any overlooked angles that might explain Madeleine's disappearance. Among the most significant testimonies they reviewed was that of Martin Smith and his family. Martin Smith and his relatives had been vacationing in PRAIA on the evening of May 3, 2007, the night Madeleine vanished. At approximately 10 p.m., the Smiths observed a man walking briskly down Rua da Escola Primaria, carrying a young blonde girl in pajamas. What caught their attention was not just the image of a child being carried at that hour, but the awkward manner in which she was held, limp and resting heavily against the man's shoulder, as if asleep or unconscious. At the time, Martin Smith did not recognize the individual. He gave a detailed description to the Portuguese police, describing the man as Caucasian, 1.75 to 180 meters tall, of average build, in his late 30s to early 40s, with short brown hair. His clothes were also noted: beige trousers made of thick material, possibly with buttons along the side, details that would later take on disturbing relevance. Several months later, after returning to Ireland, Martin Smith watched a news segment in which Gerry McCann was filmed exiting a plane with his child in his arms. In that moment, Smith reported experiencing an overwhelming sense of familiarity. The way Gerry carried his child, on the left shoulder, with the same posture and demeanor, struck him as eerily similar to the man he had seen in Praia da Luz. He later told police that he was 80% certain the man he had witnessed that night was Gerry McCann. This was not a casual observation. Smith's account represented the only significant independent sighting of a man carrying a child on the night Madeleine disappeared, unrelated to the McCann's circle of friends, and untainted by the media narrative then developing around the case. It was a lead that should have been front and center in any honest investigation. Instead, it was quietly buried. Oakley International, recognizing the importance of the Smith family statements, created a set of e-fits in 2008 based on their descriptions. These images bore an unmistakable resemblance to Gerry McCann. But when the agency prepared a report containing their findings, including the e-fits, they were met with legal threats from the McCann family's legal team. According to sources involved in the investigation, the McCanns warned Oakley International not to publish the report or its contents, including the facial composites. One investigator later stated, "I was absolutely stunned when I watched the program and saw the E-fits presented as new information. They were ours, and they had been locked away. The suppression of this report, and the E-fits within it, led to deep frustration among those hired to find the truth. Several insiders alleged that the McCanns themselves were responsible for burying the SMITHMAN lead, effectively silencing a potentially explosive connection between a witness description and Gerry McCann's appearance. The very agency they had funded was now being prevented from sharing what they believed was the most compelling line of inquiry they had uncovered. It wasn't until October 2013, 5 years after the creation of the E-fits, that they were finally shown to the public. Their debut came not through the McCanns' efforts or their official website, but via an independent investigation conducted by Scotland Yard under Operation Grange. During a special episode of the BBC's Crime Watch, detectives revealed the SMITHMAN E-fits, describing the man as a key person of interest in the case and asking the public to help identify him. The response was immediate and confused. Viewers and online sleuths alike began comparing the E-fits to Gerry McCann, noting the uncanny similarities. Questions began surfacing online. Why hadn't these images been released earlier? Why had the McCanns not included them in their numerous public appeals or on their dedicated website? Most damning of all, even after the Crime Watch broadcast, the E-fits were still not uploaded to the McCanns' official campaign site, Find Madeleine McCann. It wasn't until August 2015, nearly 2 full years later, that the SMITHMAN E-fits were quietly added to the site. By that point, many viewed the gesture as too little, too late. The delay only deepened suspicion that the McCanns had intentionally avoided drawing attention to an image that might be interpreted, fairly or unfairly, as resembling Gerry. This suspicion gained more traction when people began comparing specific elements of Martin Smith's original witness description to Gerry McCann's known appearance height. The man was estimated at 1.75 to 1.80 meters. Gerry's height exactly. Age: Smith described the man as 35 to 40 years old. Gerry was 39 at the time. Build: average, athletic, slightly lean, again matching Gerry. Hair: short brown in a simple cut, precisely how Gerry wore his hair. Clothing: Smith recalled beige trousers with a distinct thickness and button detail. Photographs show Gerry wearing nearly identical trousers in June 2007, just weeks after the sighting. In light of these details, many observers have asked a difficult question: was the SMITHMAN E-fit suppressed because it looked too much like Gerry McCann? Of course, without hard evidence, no such accusation can be proven. But the sequence of events, the creation of the E-fit, the suppression of the report, the legal threats to the investigators, the years-long delay before the public release, and the continued absence of the image from official McCann communications suggest a conscious decision to minimize the impact of this lead. In any missing person case, transparency is critical. Families of victims are expected to cooperate fully, embrace every lead, and assist in following up on any credible sighting. When a facial composite closely matching the father of the missing child is created by the family's own investigators and then quietly shelved for years, it inevitably raises questions, not necessarily about guilt, but about motive, fear, and what lengths people might go to in order to protect themselves from scrutiny, whether justified or not. The case of the SMITHMAN E-fit is not just a side story in the Madeleine McCann investigation. It is a mirror held up to the deeper ambiguities that have surrounded this mystery from the beginning. And for many, it remains one of the most compelling what-ifs in a case full of unanswered questions. On the evening of May 3, 2007, at approximately 9:55 to 10 p.m., Martin Smith and his family, his wife, his son Peter, and his daughter Oif were returning to their holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. As they walked along Rua da Escola Primaria, a narrow residential street in the coastal resort town, they noticed something unusual. A man was walking briskly in the opposite direction, carrying a young blonde-haired girl who appeared to be wearing light-colored or pink pajamas. The child's arms were limp Her head rested heavily on the man's shoulder, and the overall posture of the pair indicated not comfort, but haste. There was no conversation. The man said nothing as he passed the Smiths. He looked straight ahead and avoided eye contact. His demeanor was not frantic or panicked, but he moved with clear purpose, as if trying to avoid being noticed, while also not doing anything overtly suspicious. It was a fleeting moment, but one that became increasingly important as the hours turned into days, and the name Madeleine McCann swept across headlines around the world. Unbeknownst to the Smiths at the time, that exact window, between 9:55 and 10 p.m., was believed to be the most likely time frame during which Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A at the Ocean Club Resort. The route where the Smiths saw the man carrying the child was not far from the apartment, and crucially, it was in the opposite direction of where another, ultimately discredited, sighting by Jane Tanner had directed police focus in the earliest days of the investigation. Initially, Martin Smith and his family provided their descriptions to the Portuguese police without linking the man to anyone they knew or had seen in the media. Martin described the man as Caucasian, approximately 1.75 to 1.80 meters tall, aged between 35 and 40, with an average to slightly lean build. His hair was short brown and cut in a basic style. He was wearing beige trousers made from thick material, described as possibly cotton or canvas, and a plain, long-sleeved top. Oif Smith provided a similarly focused detail, remarking on the trousers in particular beige in color, slightly textured, with buttons possibly along the side, and with no noticeable pattern or decoration. Peter Smith also noted that the man had a slightly tanned complexion, likely from sun exposure, and an athletic, healthy appearance. The descriptions were consistent and detailed, and they closely matched the appearance of one man in particular, Gerry McCann. At the time, this resemblance went unnoticed. But several months later, while watching the BBC News, Martin Smith saw footage of Gerry McCann returning to the UK from Portugal, carrying one of his children in his arms. What struck Martin was not just the facial similarity, but the body language. The way Gerry carried his child, positioned on the left shoulder, the same stride, the same distribution of weight, was eerily similar to the man Martin had seen that night. The image triggered a strong reaction, enough for Martin Smith to contact the police again and amend his statement. He told them that he was now 60 to 80% sure that the man he had seen carrying the child on May 3 was Gerry McCann. This was not a casual comment made in passing. It was a measured reassessment by a calm, credible witness, one who had no prior relationship with the McCanns and no incentive to involve himself further. He did not speak to the media or seek attention. He simply did what any responsible citizen might do when a memory sharpens in hindsight. He spoke up again. Despite the significance of this update, Martin Smith's testimony received surprisingly little attention in the public discourse surrounding the case. More troubling still, no major emphasis was placed on the glaring inconsistency it raised. If the man seen carrying the child at 10 p.m. was indeed Gerry McCann, what was he doing outside the apartment at that time? According to the McCanns and their circle of friends, Gerry was at the tapas bar around 10 p.m., the time they reported Madeleine missing. However, this alibi, like much of the group's timeline, was never independently verified. There were no surveillance cameras documenting his whereabouts, no time-stamped photos, and no witness outside the tapas group who could confirm Gerry's precise location between 9:55 and 10:05 p.m. The statements of the Tapas 7 contained inconsistencies, both in timing and in their descriptions of who left the table when. The exact moment Gerry re-entered apartment 5A to check on the children, and whether he remained there longer than he claimed, remains unclear to this day. In any serious investigation, an unconfirmed alibi at the exact time of a disappearance is cause for concern. In this case, it made Martin Smith's testimony all the more crucial. His was the only credible, independent sighting of a man carrying a small girl in Praia da Luz that night. And yet, curiously, his account was largely ignored in media coverage and official briefings for years. Even more puzzling was the treatment of the e-fits developed from the Smith family's descriptions. These composite sketches, remarkably similar to Gerry McCann, were created in 2008 by Oakley International, a private investigation firm hired by the McCanns themselves. But instead of being published immediately to generate leads, the e-fits were suppressed, allegedly due to legal threats made by the McCanns toward the agency if they released the report. The e-fits would not appear publicly until October 2013, during a televised appeal by Scotland Yard's Operation Grange. And even then, they were not posted on the McCanns' official Find Madeleine.com website until 2015, years after other, far less significant composite sketches had been published. Why was this particular testimony sidelined? Skeptics argue that the reason may lie in the resemblance itself. The SMITHMAN e-fit, paired with the witness's updated belief that the man was Gerry, presented a deeply uncomfortable implication. To acknowledge it publicly would have invited scrutiny, not just of an anonymous suspect, but of Madeleine's own father. Whether or not one believes in Gerry McCann's involvement in his daughter's disappearance, the deliberate omission of this testimony from public view for so long raises legitimate questions about transparency and narrative control. To this day, Martin Smith's sighting remains one of the most specific, time-relevant, and independently verified accounts from the night Madeleine McCann disappeared. His decision to revise his statement after seeing Gerry McCann on television was neither rushed nor exaggerated. It was thoughtful, careful, and supported by multiple family members who had witnessed the same man. And yet, his voice, his recollection, and his warning were buried for years. In a case defined by absence of evidence, of resolution, of clarity, the absence of proper attention to Martin Smith's testimony stands out as one of the most troubling omissions of all. Familiarity with terrain. For Kate and Gerry McCann, PRAIA da Luz was not just a holiday destination. According to their own accounts and testimony from close friends, it became a landscape they physically mapped with their footsteps, particularly through their shared habit of long-distance running. From the first pages of Madeleine, Kate McCann's memoir about the disappearance of her daughter, a recurring motif emerges: running. She didn't just run to stay fit. She ran to cope, to escape the crushing weight of grief and fear that arrived with the loss of her child. "Running helped me breathe," she wrote. It was a physical release from the nightmare that began on the night of May 3, 2007. But what's often overlooked in her heartfelt recollection is the critical secondary insight. By running every day, before and after the disappearance, both Kate and Gerry became intimately familiar with the geography of Luz. Not just the ocean view and the cafes around the Ocean Club Resort, but the alleys, the unlit paths, the shortcuts, and the obscure coastal routes that only locals or regular runners would know. This familiarity was not incidental. It was sharpened through repetition. Matt Oldfield, a close friend of the McCanns and a fellow member of the Tapas 7 group, confirmed under police questioning that Kate was not just a casual jogger. She was committed and experienced. "I went running with Kate, and she was very good," Matt testified. "She knew the long road out past Luz, probably 6 to 8 miles round trip." His account adds credibility to the idea that Kate's understanding of the Luz terrain extended far beyond the immediate surroundings of the Ocean Club. This wasn't a woman jogging in circles around a familiar hotel block. She explored the outskirts. She knew the winding trails, the inclines, the gravel roads leading away from the beach, and the steep cuts through residential areas. More importantly, she preferred the difficult paths, the ones that required exertion and brought solitude. This means that Kate had access to and awareness of paths that could avoid populated areas, paths where someone could disappear into quiet shadows without being seen. If a person knew they needed to move discreetly, away from public view, perhaps even while carrying something or someone, these were the very routes one would choose. Further confirmation of this terrain knowledge came not from Kate herself, but from her friend Fiona Payne. Fiona was one of the last people to see Madeleine alive, and she stayed close to Kate in the days that followed. During one of their shared walks through the Ocean Club complex, Kate pointed out a shortcut, an overgrown path that cut between buildings, partially hidden by hedges and wending through a private garden area. Fiona was surprised. She admitted in her statement that she had never known that road existed, despite staying in the same resort. This simple moment, two women walking, and one showing the other a hidden path, raises critical questions. How did Kate discover that shortcut? How many more did she know? And most importantly, did this knowledge play a role, not in Madeleine's disappearance, but in what happened afterward? The implication is subtle but unsettling. Someone who knows hidden or little-used routes has a strategic advantage if they wish to avoid detection. If Kate and Gerry needed to reach a distant location without being seen by police, guests, or passers-by, they knew how to do it. The clearest and perhaps most haunting example of Kate's terrain memory comes in her own words. In Madeleine, she recounts one particular run in vivid detail. It wasn't just about movement. It was about purpose. She describes jogging through Roda PRAIA, a road sloping down toward the ocean. Then she climbs toward Rocha Negra, the black rock cliffs that rise imposingly to the east of Praia de Los. I remember running up Roda PRAIA and heading up toward Rocha Negra. She wrote, I was carrying a photo of Madeleine in my hand, gripping it hard when I got tired. I repeated the rosary in my head to keep myself going. This description is more than emotional. It is geographically precise. Roda PRAIA connects the ocean club to the beachfront but also splits into several paths that meander up the hills. Rocha Negra, with its steep, rugged inclines and minimal foot traffic, is not an easy or casual destination. For Kate to describe this run with such accuracy implies repeated visits. She had not only traveled this route before she had memorized it. Rocha Negra is significant for another reason: its seclusion. Unlike the bustling promenade or the tourist-filled boardwalk, Rocha Negra is remote, quiet, and difficult to access. It is also largely outside the view of public spaces and security cameras. A place, perhaps, where no one would notice if a person walked by carrying something. In most missing child investigations, especially when there is suspicion of foul play, one of the first questions investigators ask is, who knew the area? Who had time to plan or map escape routes? Who could disappear into the night without leaving footprints? Running gives more than fitness. It gives knowledge. It gives habit. It creates opportunity. Kate and Gerry McCann had an unusually detailed understanding of the geography around Los. They knew the side paths, the cliffs, the slopes, and the streets most tourists would never find. Even more critically, they could access those places with confidence and speed, traits especially important if someone wanted to avoid being seen. Though there is no direct evidence suggesting that either of them used this knowledge for sinister purposes, the question persists. Why were so many details about their movements, their habits, and their deep knowledge of the area left out of early police reports? Why did this level of terrain expertise only emerge later? Through witness statements and book excerpts, familiarity with the landscape of Praia da Luz was not a small detail. It was central. It determined what was possible and what was not. And yet, early investigations barely touched it. The McCanns' extensive running routines, their physical familiarity with isolated paths, and their preference for long distances away from crowded areas, these are the very things that should have raised red flags early on. But they didn't. The narrative was quickly locked into one path: an abduction from the bedroom. The terrain told another story, a quieter one. A story of people who knew every curve of the land, who could slip between buildings unseen, and who had the physical capacity and emotional drive to do so, even in the most desperate moments of their lives. And in the shadows of those narrow paths, unanswered questions still remain. If the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was not an abduction, but rather the result of an unintentional accident inside apartment 5A, then the implications for her parents, Kate and Gerry McCann, are vast and severe. In that scenario, a critical distinction emerges. The tragedy would not lie solely in the death of a child, but in the choices made afterward, the failure to call emergency services, the concealment of a body, and the deliberate suppression of facts that could have helped uncover the truth. These are not the actions of negligent parents. These are, by legal definition, acts that could constitute obstruction of justice, desecration of a corpse, and withholding of evidence in a criminal investigation. Even if Madeleine's death had been accidental, a fall, asphyxiation, or a medical emergency, the McCanns' decision to not immediately report it would have exposed them to the full force of the law. As licensed medical professionals, they would have been expected to react swiftly and responsibly. Any deviation from that expectation could lead to criminal prosecution. Moreover, the consequences would go beyond courtroom repercussions. The McCanns risked losing custody of their remaining children, the twins, and becoming the primary subjects of an international criminal probe, possibly for years to come. In this context, a small window of time becomes hauntingly significant. Between 5 and 7 a.m. on May 4, the morning after Madeleine was reported missing, the couple left their apartment. This excursion was not disclosed in their official 2007 police statements. To investigators, this omission remains suspicious. Why hide that specific period? Unless acknowledging it would require explaining actions that are legally and morally indefensible. The choice to remain silent about this morning walk, possibly to dispose of evidence, casts a long shadow over their credibility. But legal risks are just one part of the equation. The McCanns were not ordinary tourists. Gerry was a respected cardiologist. Kate, a practicing general practitioner. Their careers were built on public trust and societal responsibility. Any implication that they had lied to police, manipulated timelines, or hidden critical evidence could shatter their professional standing overnight. Medical licenses could be revoked. Hospital privileges could be rescinded. The respectability they had earned over decades would dissolve instantly. Public perception, too, would change drastically. As long as they were viewed as grieving parents, they were met with sympathy and financial support. Over $4 million was donated to the Find Madeleine Fund. But if they were to be seen as deceptive, or worse, culpable, the backlash would be swift and unforgiving. Friends would distance themselves. Colleagues would reconsider their character. The media, always hungry for a new angle, would transform them from victims into villains. And yet, not all of this must be interpreted through a calculated lens. Psychology offers a parallel explanation. In moments of overwhelming trauma, human behavior often departs from rational norms. Denial is a powerful mental refuge. Panic distorts judgment. Self-preservation becomes instinctual. If Madeleine died in a moment of neglect or misjudgment, Kate and Gerry might have succumbed to fear and shame, leading them to a decision they could never undo. Once that decision was made, every step that followed, from concealing the truth to silencing independent investigators, may have been driven more by desperation than deceit. Still, there are choices they made that are difficult to explain away emotionally. One of the most striking examples lies in the now infamous SMITHMAN e-fit. In 2008, the McCanns' own hired investigators at Oakley International produced an e-fit based on the testimony of Martin Smith and his family, witnesses who claimed to have seen a man carrying a blonde girl in pajamas around 10 p.m. on May 3. The description closely resembled Gerry McCann, his height, build, hair, and even the beige trousers with buttons he was photographed wearing that summer. Rather than release this composite, the McCanns allegedly threatened to sue Oakley International if the report was made public. For 5 years, the SMITHMAN e-fit was buried. When it finally surfaced in 2013, thanks to a BBC Crime Watch segment spearheaded by Scotland Yard, it caused an uproar. Notably, the McCanns still refrained from posting the image on their official website, only doing so 2 years later in 2015. The optics were clear. This was not a family desperate to reveal every lead. This was a family selectively revealing leads. Behind this strategy was a sophisticated media machine. The McCanns hired Bell Pottinger, one of the UK's most elite PR firms, to manage their narrative. Press statements were carefully worded. Media appearances were calculated. The Find Madeleine website became not just a search tool, but a curated platform where favorable leads were amplified and inconvenient ones were ignored. While the British press largely supported the McCanns, Portuguese journalists, closer to the ground and less influenced by UK sentiment, often raised sharper questions. Why were certain details omitted? Why were specific timelines vague? Why did so many elements of the story remain unverifiable? These are not mere oversights. They form what some analysts call a temporal gap strategy. By avoiding the disclosure of key facts early on, such as the early morning excursion on May 4th or the release of the SMITHMAN E-Fit, the McCanns created a buffer of time. Over months and years, memories fade. Public focus shifts. When information is finally introduced, it often lacks the impact it would have had at the height of scrutiny. A mother opening a trash bin in search of her daughter sounds emotional in a memoir, but it might have sounded incriminating in a police statement. By waiting years to release certain facts, the McCanns gained narrative control. In the public mind, delayed disclosures feel less like revelations and more like reflective hindsight. The question remains whether this strategy was meant to soften the blow of painful truths or to hide those truths entirely. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann remains one of the most baffling cases in modern history. But sometimes, what is hidden speaks louder than what is revealed. In legal, social, psychological, and media terms, the McCanns' actions point toward an intricate and deliberate attempt to manage risk, preserve reputation, and steer public emotion. Whether these actions stem from guilt or fear, or both, is still the subject of global debate. But one fact is inescapable: truth cannot be edited indefinitely. And time, no matter how cleverly manipulated, does not forget. In the 2011 memoir Madeleine, Kate McCann offered the public an intimate glimpse into the events surrounding her daughter's disappearance. The book was widely received as a mother's attempt to reclaim the narrative after years of scrutiny. But for some readers, one detail in particular raised more questions than it answered. In the section where she included a map of the resort area near apartment 5A, where Madeleine was last seen, the layout had a subtle yet highly suspicious anomaly. Over the eastern side of Rua de Escola Primaria, the exact street where witness Martin Smith reported seeing a man carrying a small blonde girl around 10 p.m. on May 3, there was a conspicuous label: Baptista Supermarket. The problem? Baptista Supermarket was not located in that spot. This labeling, whether accidental or deliberate, effectively obscured the very area that investigators and independent researchers would later identify as a zone of high interest. The visual misdirection, embedded within a book meant to generate sympathy and support, gave rise to theories that this was not just poor cartography, but a psychological maneuver, a subtle act of narrative control designed to divert attention away from a dangerous coincidence. Was this merely an oversight, or was it a calculated act to suppress scrutiny of a location tied to a highly incriminating eyewitness account? Beyond the cartographic discrepancy, the area in question, the triangle formed by Rua da Calheta, Rua 25 de Abril, and Rua de Escola Primaria, contained several abandoned or unoccupied homes. Despite being just minutes away from the McCann's apartment, and despite being the precise area where Smith claimed to have seen the man with the child, there was no record of a full systematic search there, especially during the critical 48-hour window following Madeleine's disappearance. Local residents and Portuguese journalists later expressed frustration at what they viewed as a glaring blind spot in the investigation. Why weren't the vacant houses searched floor to floor? Why didn't police or private investigators, including those hired by the McCanns themselves, call for a complete forensic sweep of this nearby zone? One could dismiss this as investigative overload or early chaos, but when combined with other anomalies, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Consider the timeline of May 3rd itself. The McCanns and their friends, the so-called Tapas 7, maintained that they had dinner together at the tapas bar that evening, leaving their children asleep in their respective apartments. They took turns checking on the kids, according to their statements. But no independent witnesses, neither restaurant staff nor other resort guests, could confirm the exact presence and whereabouts of the group members at specific times between 8:30 p.m. and 10:15 p.m. There were no security cameras, no receipts, no logs. Just their word, and their word was not consistent. Gerry McCann claimed he went to check on Madeleine around 9:05 p.m. Matt Oldfield said he did so again around 9:30 p.m., this time on Kate's behalf. But the critical window between 9:50 p.m. and 10 p.m., the very time frame in which Martin Smith saw the man carrying a child, remains unaccounted for. None of the Tapas group could confirm Gerry's whereabouts during those minutes with absolute certainty. This absence of a verifiable alibi, coupled with the lack of cross-verification, even within their own group, casts a long shadow over the most crucial hour of the case. And yet, despite the glaring significance of Martin Smith's account, an independent witness with no prior connection to the McCanns, his statement was met not with amplification, but with silence. Martin, along with his daughter Oif and son Peter, gave a clear and consistent description: a Caucasian man of medium build, short brown hair, wearing beige trousers and carrying a blonde girl in pajamas. Months later, after watching television footage of Gerry McCann carrying one of his twins upon returning to the UK, Martin became alarmed. He contacted police again, stating he was 60 to 80% sure that the man he saw that night in Praia da Luz was Gerry McCann. Despite this, Kate and Gerry McCann made no public appeals for information on SMITHMAN. There were no press conferences, no reconstructions, not even a mention in the Madeleine book. Even more troubling, they possessed an E-fit composite created from the Smith family's descriptions as early as 2008, commissioned by the private detectives they themselves had hired using the Find Madeleine Fund. And yet, this image was never released to the public until 2013, and only then through the intervention of Operation Grange, Scotland Yard's independent investigation. The McCanns did not upload the image to their official website until 2015, 7 years after it had been quietly buried. In the world of missing persons, time is the enemy of truth. Memories fade. Evidence disappears. Eyewitnesses move on or grow unsure. That is why early leads are so critical. Martin Smith's statement should have galvanized efforts. Instead, it was left to gather dust. For critics, the pattern is not just suspicious, it is strategic. When you combine the obscured map, the unsearched triangle of houses, the lack of confirmed whereabouts during the most vital time frame, and the suppression of a potentially case-defining witness statement, what emerges is not a series of oversights, but a potential blueprint for narrative control. Why would a family seeking justice for their missing daughter not highlight the only credible sighting of her that night? Why would they withhold an image that could help the public identify a suspect? And why would they obscure the location of that sighting in the only visual aid presented in their own published account? No one can answer those questions definitively, but their silence speaks. In the early morning hours of May 4, 2007, just hours after Madeleine McCann was reported missing, an unusual incident occurred that would not be publicly acknowledged for years. Fiona Payne, a member of the so-called Tapa 7 group, later testified that at around 5:00 a.m., Kate McCann knocked on her door. Kate reportedly asked to leave the apartment and go out. But this seemingly minor detail was absent from Kate's official witness statement given to police in 2007. It would not be mentioned until 4 years later, when Kate released her memoir, Madeleine, in 2011. Around 2 hours later, at approximately 7 a.m., a local Portuguese resident, Paulo Nito, claimed he saw Kate and Gerry McCann walking alone in the streets of Praia da Luz. They were not accompanied by police officers, friends, or any press. There were no surveillance cameras documenting the walk. If the couple had indeed just lost their daughter and were frantically searching, why was this early morning action kept hidden from the public record? Why was such an important movement not mentioned in their immediate statements? Why did it take 4 years and a book release for this moment to surface? These questions are at the heart of an unsettling pattern that emerges when reviewing the McCann case through a new lens, not one of guilt, but of concealment. Because if someone truly had nothing to hide, Why were so many potentially helpful facts either omitted, delayed, or withheld? Perhaps the most pressing example of this pattern is the case of the SMITHMAN e-fit. In 2008, a set of facial composites was created based on the testimony of Martin Smith and his family, Irish tourists who reported seeing a man carrying a small blonde girl near Rua de Escola Primaria around 9:55 p.m. on the night of Madeleine's disappearance. According to Martin Smith, the man walked briskly but calmly. He didn't speak, didn't seem panicked, and was dressed in beige trousers and a short haircut, features that would later bear an unsettling resemblance to Gerry McCann. Months later, Martin saw a broadcast showing Gerry carrying one of his twins down an airport stairway. Shocked by the similarity in gait and posture, he contacted the police again, stating he was 60 to 80% sure the man he saw that night was Gerry McCann. Yet, instead of using this potential lead to widen the investigation, the McCann family allegedly threatened legal action against Oakley International, the detective agency that created the e-fit. The composite was suppressed. It wasn't until 2013, 5 years later, and only through the efforts of Operation Grange, a British police review, that the SMITHMAN e-fit was shown publicly on television. Even then, the McCanns did not publish it on their official website Find Madeleine.com until August 2015. This raises a critical question. If the e-fit was unrelated to Gerry McCann, and if it truly represented a possible abductor, why wasn't it shared with the world immediately? Despite being the only credible account from a neutral party of someone potentially taking Madeleine, Martin Smith's statement never received the attention it deserved. His sighting occurred within the same critical timeframe as Madeleine's disappearance, and he had no ties to the McCanns or the Ocean Club. Still, no press conference was ever held to encourage the public to help identify SMITHMAN. No media campaign was launched around his detailed account, and no action was taken by the private investigators funded by the McCanns' £2 million Find Madeleine campaign to follow up on this critical lead. This inaction becomes even more significant considering how thoroughly other, less reliable sightings were publicized in the years that followed. It prompts the question, was Smith's testimony ignored, not because it lacked credibility, but because it pointed in an uncomfortable direction? To manage their public image and narrative, the McCanns hired Bell Pottinger, one of the UK's most elite public relations firms. This agency specialized in crisis management, reputation repair, and media messaging. Alongside this, the McCanns established Find Madeleine.com, intended to be the definitive source for updates about the case. But key pieces of information were conspicuously absent from the site for years. The SMITHMAN e-fit, for example, wasn't posted until 2015, despite being created in 2008. Martin Smith's sighting was also never emphasized or elaborated upon. When Portuguese media questioned the lack of attention given to his testimony, they received no response. Meanwhile, British media, largely sympathetic to the McCanns, pushed the abduction narrative without exploring alternative explanations. The Portuguese press, by contrast, remained skeptical and questioned inconsistencies in the case. The McCanns sued or threatened legal action against several Portuguese journalists and former police officers, including Gonçalo Amaral, whose book accused them of a cover-up. The neighborhood surrounding apartment 5A had many unoccupied homes, especially within the triangle bordered by Rua de Calheta, Rua 25 de Abril, and Rua de Escola Primaria. This was precisely the area where Martin Smith said he saw the man with the child. Yet, these locations were not fully searched in the first 48 hours, the most critical window in any missing person investigation. Portuguese locals later criticized both the police and the McCanns for not pushing harder to examine these abandoned properties, just a few minutes' walk from the Ocean Club. The question remains, why was such an obvious area overlooked? Another disturbing pattern emerges when observing the timing of key disclosures. The early morning walk, the e-fit, and even small but potentially revealing actions, like Kate checking trash bins, were not documented in their 2007 statements. Instead, these details appeared years later, often in books or controlled interviews. By gradually releasing information over time, a fog is created, the public memory fades, contradictions become harder to track, and perhaps, narratives can be more easily reshaped. The McCann case is not closed, and Madeleine has never been found. But when one considers the selective publication of critical data, the avoidance of pursuing leads like SMITHMAN, and the overwhelming emphasis on media image over transparent cooperation, it forces us to ask difficult questions. Because when the effort to control outweighs the effort to search, the line between victim and orchestrator becomes dangerously thin. And in that space, where truth is hidden beneath layers of spin, justice may remain permanently out of reach.